Hello, welcome to my garden. We are recording here for the Festival of Science and Humanities. So this is going to be a presentation about the crown and the paintbrush. The politics of representation of British sovereigns in portraiture. So we'll talk about the paintings and different ways that British, first English, then after the unification with Scotland, British kings and queens were presented in paintings and other forms of art. So we need to go quite a way back to begin. I think we may start in the Middle Ages, and if we look at the representations of medieval English kings, so we'll start with England, people normally didn't know what their monarch looked like. They could see very limited types of royal representations, for example on coins that were in circulation. So if you were rich, if you had money, you could see some likeness of the king or queen, mostly kings in this period, represented on the coin. They could see royal representations in books, in illuminated medieval books, but these were not portraits. These were usually very symbolic representations of monarchs, either recent or historical monarchs. They could also see the representations on seals that were used for official documents, and on tombs, on grave effigies, the sculptures that were put on tombs of kings and queens after they died. These were probably the most similar, the most likely portraits, and you could have some idea what the king or queen looked like, but they were very rare, really. How many graves does a person have? So we really do not have royal portraiture showing likenesses of the king before Richard II. Richard II, who came to the throne as a very young boy and who was later deposed by the man who would take the name of Henry IV. So one of the first royal representations that could be called a portrait, although not really in the modern sense, so it's not the kind of portrait that only shows the sitter, but shows the sitter in a very specific, in this case religious setting, is in a painting, a double-sided painting called a diptych, Wilton diptych, because this is where the hello Watson, meet Watson, my cat assistant. So Wilton diptych showing the young King Richard II in the company of saints. So we have some English saints like Saint Edward the Confessor in the middle behind the king, or Saint Edmund, the first Anglo-Saxon saint. We also have Saint John the Baptist, and they are all interceding for the young king. He is shown kneeling in prayer, and the saints present his supplications to the other side of the painting, which shows the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus and angels. What is interesting really is the way that the angels and holy persons are arranged. So you can see the banner of the flag of St. George, a red cross on white background, which is the traditional symbol of England, so the country that young Richard was ruling, held by angels. You also, if you look close, see the little emblem of a white deer, a white stag, which was a personal symbol of Richard II. So it's like Mary, Jesus, and the angels wearing party colors to show their support of the English crown and the young King Richard II. So it's not really about showing the young king the way he really looked, but showing him as a legitimate king with the full support of heaven. And this brings us to a little bit of theory I'd like to share with you, a rather old book, because it was first published in 1957 by a man coming from a Jewish family from Poznań. This is actually where I live now. He was born before the independence of Poland was regained, so officially he was born in the German Empire. His name was Ernst Kantorowicz, and he was a historian, mostly interested in medieval kings, and he published his very influential book in 1957 entitled The King's Two Bodies. The King's Two Bodies. And he proposed a symbolic representation based on the way that the people in the Middle Ages talked and wrote about their monarchs, that in a way each monarch, a king or a queen, has two bodies. One he called his body natural, which means a regular human body, the human side of the monarch, the way they live their lives as a person, as a human person. The other side, however, perhaps even more interesting, was called the body politic. The body politic is the official function of the monarch. All the symbols, all the myths, all the culture that is combined with the function of the king or queen. So what we have in those early medieval representations, or all those coins and seals and tomb effigies and the early paintings like the Wilton diptych, is rather the body politic of the king in question. Maybe with some exception taken for some tomb effigies, which are quite similar to life, and which might show a little bit of the human side, the body natural of the king, like here we have Henry III. But otherwise, it's really the idea of the monarch, the idea of the king that is represented. This, however, starts to change, or at least it enters into some sort of artistic discussion in the period of the Renaissance. After the Middle Ages are over, in England it means the end of the War of the Roses between the two noble houses of Lancaster and York, and the coming of the next dynasty to the throne, the Tudors. And here I have some images of the most famous, perhaps of all English kings to date. Definitely the most famous of the Tudor kings, that is King Henry VIII. The one who had 6 wives, the one who was quite famously large and strong and powerful, who sent several people, including his closest companions, friends, and some of the wives as well, to the scaffold to have their heads chopped off, and who is now a recognizable human being, as you can see, even by children. So some images taken, but made by actual children, showing King Henry VIII. We also have a sketch by a cartoon artist, but they all show the same idea. A large man standing in this very proud pose, and we do not really see any symbols of the monarch. We do not see the throne. He's not seated on the throne. He's not wearing a crown. He's not holding a scepter or an orb. So the official regalia that each monarch carries during the coronation. But everybody knows it's Henry VIII. How do they know it? Because of a very successful collaboration between King Henry VIII and his official portraitist called Hans Holbein. Another person coming from the German-speaking countries, he came to the court of Henry VIII, and he painted many people from the court, including the king himself. And as you can see, here we have two examples, because Holbein painted the king several times, sometimes the full figure, sometimes half portraits, but these are very human portraits. They show the man who happens to be the king, rather than the king who just happens to inhabit a particular human body. So the thing that Hans Holbein did for Henry VIII is really making him look like a monarch, like a very powerful royal presence, without really having to resort to traditional symbols of the crown, the scepter, or the throne. What we have is a man standing very tall and proud. He was tall and proud. He was also increasingly overweight in time, which might be seen as a problem because it might make him appear older, weaker, perhaps ridiculous, but not on Holbein's paintings. Here, even his excess weight is shown as strength, masculinity, power. Actually, we know about some ambassadors and people coming to the court, seeing these portraits and being actually frightened because they were so powerful. The most powerful one was actually a fresco, a large wall painting, life-size or even slightly bigger than life-size, showing King Henry VIII with his parents, so King Henry VII, the first of the Tudors, and his wife, and the favorite wife of King Henry VIII, although she was dead by this time. You might ask which one was the favorite. Of course it was Jane Seymour, the one who died, if you remember this little rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. That's the number 3. She actually died after giving birth to the long-awaited son and heir, Edward. So here we have a portrait painted by Holbein of Queen Jane Seymour, and here we have a copy of this large fresco with the longest inscription in the middle, being a kind of letter of advice to the young future King Edward, inspiring him to take advice and to model himself on his great father and his great dynasty, his great grandfather as well. Why is it a copy? Because the original was lost in the fire. The London palace, the Palace of Whitehall, where it was painted, burnt in the fire of London. So unfortunately the original is lost. What we have is this later copy, which probably gives you some idea about the reality of Holbein's painting. But even if we compare the representation of Queen Jane in the smaller portrait that Holbein did of her, and in this copy, you can see the difference in quality, of course. So here we have the first example of a close collaboration of an English monarch with, interestingly, a foreign portrait painter. The next important monarch, we're not going to talk about all of them because, well, not all of them liked art. Like, for example, the older daughter of Henry VIII, Queen Mary, called Bloody Mary, she didn't care much for painting, but her sister Elizabeth, who reigned as Elizabeth I, she was all about the body politic. She was all about the royal representation and the way that art, and especially painting and poetry, were supposed to strengthen the power of the monarch. So here we have some examples of Elizabeth, and by different artists. She didn't really have a favorite. Perhaps Nicholas Hilliard would be her favorite, but he specialized in miniature portraits, like very little ones that you can decorate with precious stone and wear as jewels, for example. So here we have an example of a larger portrait he did of Elizabeth, but this wasn't really his specialty. What we have here are some examples of Elizabeth's portrait, and they are not really concerned with the way Queen Elizabeth really looked. They are more interested in showing her power, in showing her virtues, in showing her intelligence and her skills as a monarch. And if you Google that, the portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, you will see a lot of examples in which the quality of painting the human form, the human face, is not really the most important thing. What is important is the symbols. So here we have an early portrait showing the coronation, or Queen Elizabeth during the coronation. She was a young woman in her 20s, and here we have her seated on the throne with a very elaborate dress, wearing a crown, holding a scepter and the orb, so all the symbols of monarchy. She is put on the throne and anointed Queen of England. Slightly later portraits show her with symbols. A symbol like the ermine. The ermine is a little white animal, as you can see, and it's actually the ermine fur that lines the coat, the cloak of Elizabeth in the coronation painting, because ermine fur was the most expensive fur that you could imagine, and only kings and queens could wear it. So by having this little animal as a pet, I'm not sure she really had ermine as a pet. They are quite difficult to train. Here we have the little symbolic gesture emphasizing that Queen Elizabeth is really royal. The other one shows her carrying a sieve, like a colander, really, like this kind of kitchen utensil that you use to sieve, I don't know, rice or pasta. Why is she carrying that? Because in Roman legends, not so much mythology but legends, this was a symbol of virginity. And at least officially, Queen Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. She never married. She had lots of proposals of marriage, but she never decided to marry anyone. And she believed that she would be more respected and stronger as a monarch if she remained unmarried. And she also said that she was a virgin. She never had sex with a man. We will never know. We have to believe her. Anyway, there are some symbols in paintings like this sieve that point to the fact that she was the Virgin Queen. The last one of Elizabeth I shows her in a very interesting scene, being a judge during another mythological story, mythological scene, the Judgment of Paris. If you remember, three goddesses competing for a golden apple for the most beautiful. So we have Hera, or to use the Roman name Juno, the Queen of Heaven. We have Athena, or Minerva, the warrior goddess, and we have Aphrodite, or Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. So of course, if you remember your Greek mythology, the one who won was Aphrodite, and this was the reason for the Trojan War. But here in this painting we have Queen Elizabeth coming with the golden apple which is one of the symbols of monarchy. Here, the orb that she carries in her hand, and all three goddesses, the queen, the warrior strategist, and the beautiful, lovely woman, they give her way. They move aside because she surpasses them all. She is more queenly than Hera. She is wiser and a better military leader than Athena, and she's more beautiful and lovely than Aphrodite. Well, this is what the contemporaries thought, and this was the official public relations of the court, and definitely this is something that Queen Elizabeth cared for much more than whether or not her likeness, especially as she aged, because she sat on the throne for quite a long time and she died an old lady. This was the most important aspect of her portraiture. So quite the other way of looking at it if we compare it with the images of her father by Holbein. After Queen Elizabeth died, the new dynasty came to the throne, the Scottish dynasty of the Stuarts. So we have James I and his son Charles I, whose reign ended very unfortunately with the Civil War, and the king was beheaded. Later, his son, also called Charles II, was invited back from exile in France, and the dynasty continued for two more generations, ending with Queen Anne. So let's look a little bit at some examples of Stuart portraiture. And we start with the first of the Stuarts on the British joint English and Scottish throne, King James I. And here we have another great international painter, Peter Paul Rubens, who produced a series of images for the ceiling of one of the royal palaces, the Palace of Whitehall. This is actually the only room that survived the fire, so the mural by Holbein was lost, but the beautiful ceiling showing the glory of the reign of King James I by Peter Paul Rubens survived. You can see it in London. And what we have are images of the king surrounded by allegorical creatures, allegorical persona. So we have two women, one symbolizing England and one symbolizing Scotland, presenting to the king who's seated on the throne, but not very much the focus of the painting, a little baby who's the Union, the new country. Or we have in the center the apotheosis, which means being taken to heaven. So King James I is actually actually taken up to heaven to reign with, I don't know, God and his angels, perhaps. So definitely it's even more boastful than the portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, and it definitely alludes to the body politic rather than the body natural. And this image was commissioned by James's son, King George, not King George, King Charles I. And why I'm saying George, because he met Peter Paul Rubens when Rubens painted the image of Saint George and the Dragon. So a legend, a Christian legend about a Christian saint, the patron saint of England. And if we look very close, the figure and the face in profile of Saint George is actually the face of the future King Charles I. So we have a well-known artist complimenting the future king, who was a great art lover himself and a collector of art as well, by comparing him to a Christian saint, and actually the patron saint of England. Even the landscape in the background looks very English. So there we go. But if we look at the portraits, the official portraits of King Charles I after his coronation, there comes another name of another international artistic superstar, the Flemish artist Anthony van Dyck. He was born in the Netherlands, but he basically moved to England. He changed his name from Anton to Anthony, and very soon Sir Anthony, because the king liked his paintings so much that he knighted the artist. And if we look at the kind of problems that Van Dyck was facing with his task of painting King Charles I, it's exactly the opposite kind of problems that Holbein had with Henry VIII. Charles I was very short, very delicately built, and not very imposing physically. But he was the king. So what can an artist do? Well, first of all, put him on a horse. And some of the portraits actually present Charles I on horseback. So he is taller, he's more imposing. He is usually presented against the backdrop of some imposing architecture or vast landscapes. And if there are any more people in the painting, they're completely dwarfed by Charles, looking very splendid and capable and powerful on his horse. The other possibility was to show him in close-up. Like here we have a very interesting triple portrait showing the same face of King Charles I from 3 different angles, because this was basically a seating for a sculpted portrait by another international superstar. The kings really had the knack for that. So Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who made this bust of King Charles, unfortunately lost in the fire of Whitehall, so we also only know the copy. The other possibility is to show the king as a private man in the family circle. He was the first king probably in Britain who was praised as being a good husband and father. So here we have him with his wife, the French princess Henrietta Maria, and 2 sons. So he is a good man, he is a good husband, a good father. Unfortunately, not everybody thought so, and the Civil War broke out, and eventually, if you know your English history, poor King Charles lay his head on the block, and it was chopped off by the axe. And we continue in a moment. So we finished with the sorry end of King Charles I. Then for a couple of years, it wasn't a very short while, England was a republic, a Commonwealth, as it was then called, ruled by elected officials, mostly Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the anti-royal party in the parliament. But after Cromwell's death, the parliament decided they wanted to have a monarch after all, and the next in line, the eldest son of the king who was beheaded, was called back from France. And here we have an illustration from the press, basically, showing him returning from France in glory. Returning as a hero, surrounded by all kinds of mythological creatures and symbols. So he returns as a hero, not really as a human. This idea that the monarchs are something superhuman, something better than ordinary mortals, was continued by the next generation of the Stuarts. So actually Charles I did not leave any children surviving, but he had a brother, and his brother had the children. So we have another generation, including his daughter Mary II, who married a prince from the Netherlands, William III, called William of Orange. They continued. It was kind of dynasty that had problems with producing offspring and producing heirs. So it didn't really last very long, but while it lasted, it was all about the allegory, about the apotheosis, about the Stuarts being surrounded by clouds and angels and mythological creatures and personifications of all kinds of virtues. So this is how the royal image was presented in the Stuart period. Then, in the early 18th century, the Stuart dynasty eventually died out, leaving no descendants, and the new dynasty, distant cousins from Hanover, were called to the throne. This period is sometimes called the Georgian period. The Hanoverian dynasty had a predilection for the name George, so the first 4 kings of this dynasty to sit on the British throne were called George. George I, George II, George III, and George IV. The first 2 are not really interesting from the artistic point of view. They were not really interested in art. They preferred music, actually. So if you like classical music, they were great patrons of Handel. So yeah, they had some hobbies as well, but painting was not one of them. However, we have some interesting things happening to the royal image during the reign of King George III and George IV. So later in the 18th century and early years of the 19th century, the Napoleonic period, basically, George IV. So on one hand, we have the traditional way of presenting the royal image here, George III. It never really stopped. So a big, full figure likeness, sometimes with the official symbols of the monarchy, sometimes just looking imposing and trying to imitate Holbein's work. The other possibility was to emphasize the family life of the monarch. So here we have a collection of 15 paintings of the family of King George III. So we have the king, his wife, Queen Charlotte, and 13 of their 15 children. And it's not even the record. The body politic versus the body natural. But this is the late 18th century or the early 19th, and the general public is no longer buying that. So what we have is really the start, the beginning of a form of art which is completely British, something that according to some art historians did not really exist before this period in Britain. And I mean political caricature. So there were painters and draftsmen like Thomas Gilray here who specialized in making fun of the royals. So here we have two images, one showing George III as a kind of stingy, miserly man, very careful with the money, and you may recall this is the king who quite famously lost his sanity towards the end of his life. The caricature here does not allude to that, but it's not very nice anyway. But the way that the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, is treated is even harsher. He is a fat, lazy glutton. He just spends his time eating, drinking, taking drugs, and seducing women. We have symbols of all these things here in this caricature, and the royal court couldn't do much about that. They had to swallow the bitter pill. When George IV finally came to the throne in 1820, he tried to counteract this negative image, for example, by putting forward his great interest and love of Scotland. He had an official visit to Scotland, during which he wore the traditional Highland dress with the kilt, and the official court painter, David Wilkie, portrayed him wearing the kilt. So this is the best that King George IV could look, probably, but still the monarchy as the institution was quite unpopular. This changes with George IV's niece, the daughter of his younger brother, whose name is Victoria, and who broke the record for the length of her reign by that time. It was only surpassed by Queen Elizabeth II relatively recently. Victoria sat on the throne for more than 63 years, so of course her body changed. And if we look at the official portraits, the ones that concentrate on the body politic, we see the young woman transforming into a mature woman and an old lady, especially after her husband, her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861. She was in her early 40s, but she never took off the widow's clothes for the remainder of her life, that is 40 years. So if we look at the portrait, the coronation portrait of Victoria as a young girl, she was only 18 when she came to the throne, and compare it with something from the middle of her reign, and then the later period when she was a widow, we can see similar ideas really of greatness, of monarchy and magnificence. And they are all made, not all, the one in the middle is made by her favorite painter, and she had again a great collaboration with a foreign artist, this time a German artist called Franz Xaver Winterhalter. And besides those official portraits, he painted all kinds of private portraits of Victoria and her family, including her husband, Prince Albert, and their many children. They had 9 children together. So one of the very successful portraits, because very often these portraits would be put on exhibition before they were hung in private rooms of the royal family. So one of the most popular portraits shows Victoria and her family in 1846. So here we have 5 children. It's it's like the family on the throne. So a new idea that Victoria is not only a great queen, but a model woman. She is the best wife, the best mother. She is a little bit like those middle-class ladies that read about her in the press. And the image of Victoria as a loving mother and loving, submissive wife is very visible in Winterhalter's work. Here we have some examples. One, Victoria with the Prince of Wales, future King Edward VII. Another one with one of her younger sons. It looks like she's breastfeeding, which she never did in real life. And the so-called secret portrait, which was very private, which was a gift from Victoria to Prince Albert, and it shows her in the most sexy pose you can imagine in Victorian epoch. So here we have her with her hair undone and looking quite pretty. So Victoria's reign changed the popular perception of the monarchy for the better. This was continued later on, although none of Victoria's successors, her son, grandson, and the following monarchs, had this kind of charisma that characterized Queen Victoria. So we have, of course, the official portrait, like here we have George V, so Victoria's grandson, and his son, King George VI, the father of the present queen. So as you can see, they are quite typical for official portraits, so looking dignified, wearing this robe with ermine fur I mentioned already, sometimes with some symbols of the office, like the scepter or the crown. Very often the crown is positioned next to the queen. This is the tradition that started in some portraits of Elizabeth I. So the crown is there, but not on the head of the monarch, unless it's a coronation portrait. And the last few minutes I'd like to devote to showing you some portraits of Queen Elizabeth II. So the current queen, who has been sitting on the throne the longest of all British monarchs, and who has just celebrated her 95th birthday. So she is a very, I would say, elderly lady. But of course, again, she came to the throne as a young woman in her 20s, and she had many portraits painted. Interestingly, she seems to favor foreign artists, and many of the official portraits that are officially endorsed by the Queen were made by foreign artists. So here we have two portraits made by an Italian, Pietro Anigioni. So one from around the time of the coronation, and then 25 years later. We have another portrait for the jubilee of 50 years on the throne, painted by a Russian artist, Sergei Pavlenko. But the last one I'd like to show you is probably the most unusual of them all. Painted by a British painter. Of course, he's not. The family is not entirely British. The family comes from Austria, as you can see by the name Lucian Freud. Yes, he is the descendant of the famous Dr. Freud, and this is the way he painted the Queen. Very much as a human person, as an elderly woman, in close-up, showing all the imperfections that the age could do on her skin, showing her grey hair, and it is all contrasted with this splendid crown that she is wearing. The Queen didn't like it. There is a famous saying that Queen Victoria had a phrase, "We are not amused." She probably never said it, but I would expect Queen Elizabeth II to say it when she was presented with Lucian Freud's portrait of her. But in a way, it goes back to the body natural. It goes back to the frail, vulnerable human body of the queen that is subject to disease, to time, and also to the scrutiny of the public gaze. So there we go. Very, very quick overview of the royal representations, from the symbols to the humans. And yeah, thank you very much.